There is a reason, dear listener, that our grandfathers' grandfathers spoke of the Middle Ages not as a golden dream, but as a lingering nightmare. Now, in this year of progress and steam, when factories hum and locomotives thunder across the countryside, many romanticize the castles, the knights, and the courtly love songs of that long age. But those who lived beneath the shadow of those stone towers would laugh bitterly. If they had the strength, the medieval world was no fairy tale. It was a cage built of hunger, disease, and fear. A cage whose bars were forged not only by poverty, but by ignorance. And though the poets may sing of noble kings and gallant heroes, the truth is that most men and women of that time never saw a king, nor heard the rustle of silk in the halls of power. They lived and died in mud huts, scratching the earth with crude tools, praying that the rains might come, or that they might stop, before everything was drowned. Life was short, brutish, and bitter. The average man or woman was lucky to see 35 summers. Children were born into a world where half of them would not live long enough to know the weight of adulthood. Mothers carried their babes in trembling arms, knowing the odds were against them from the first gasp of breath. And those who survived, they were not spared. For every year, a new trial waited: famine, pestilence, the greedy hand of lords, or the cruel summons of war. The great poets of the 19th century may gaze at the ruins of abbeys and castles and think of romance. But when I gaze, I see bloodstains in the mortar. I see fields stripped bare by marching armies. I smell the smoke of villages burned for taxes unpaid. For the Middle Ages were not merely an era of swords and shining armor. They were an age of chains, and in those chains the people groaned. The peasants, bound to the land, tilled not for themselves, but for the Lord whose castle loomed above them. The tithe was demanded by the church, the tax by the crown. And what remained after the hunger of both was taken was barely enough to keep the body from collapsing. Starvation was no stranger. It was a frequent guest. A bad harvest could mean death for hundreds. A long winter could mean entire families curled together in the dark, waiting for warmth that never came. Yes, my friend, it was a time when the wolf prowled not only in the forest, but at the door of every home. And yet, worse than hunger was the shadow that carried no visible form, the shadow of plague. But let us not leap too quickly into pestilence and war. First, let us walk slowly through the villages of the 13th and 14th centuries. Imagine yourself there. The dirt road sucking at your boots with mud, the stench of refuse thick in your nose, the coughs of the sick and the hungry in your ears. You would see hovels, not homes. You would see faces hollowed by want, backs bent by endless toil. And you would understand why the Middle Ages were not an age to envy, but one to fear. The castles, yes, they stood tall, but they were fortresses of oppression, not havens of safety. The lords inside feasted on venison and wine, while the people outside gnawed on black bread that could break a tooth. The knights who wore shining armor were not guardians of the weak. They were enforcers of their master's will. Swords sharpened not against dragons, but against those too poor to pay. So when you ask me why it sucked living in medieval times, I will tell you plainly it was because life itself was a gamble, and most men lost. The dice were loaded, always in favor of the few and against the many. And those who dreamed of freedom often dreamed their last. For rebellion was crushed with fire and steel. Ah, but this is only the beginning. We have not yet spoken of pestilence, of war, of superstition that chained the mind as tightly as shackles bound the wrists. We have not yet spoken of how men and women, beaten down by misery, still clung to scraps of hope offered by wandering preachers or charlatan healers. No, to understand why the Middle Ages were a prison, we must walk further into their darkness. And if you will follow, I shall guide you through the centuries of pain until the picture stands before you in all its dreadful truth. If hunger was the constant companion of the medieval poor, Then pestilence was the lurking beast, striking when least expected, devouring whole towns in weeks. It is difficult here in the 1800s, when physicians speak of anatomy with precision and surgeons wield instruments forged of steel, to imagine how utterly helpless the people of the Middle Ages were against disease, for they did not understand it. To them, sickness was not the invisible work of parasites and contagion. It was punishment from God, a curse from a neighbor, or the malignant influence of stars drifting in the heavens. The most dreadful of these scourges was the Black Death. Ah, that name still chills the heart, even centuries after it first swept across Europe. In the year of our Lord 1347, it crept ashore from the east, carried in the bellies of ships and in the fleas upon rats. From that moment, Europe was no longer a land of men and women. It was a charnel house. Picture it: narrow streets where waste was thrown from windows, festering in gutters. The stench of rot already hung in the air before the plague arrived, and once it did, the very smell became unbearable. The sick were marked by swellings, great blackened buboes upon their necks, underarms and groins. Fevers burned the flesh, blood poured from mouths and noses, and in mere days the living were turned to corpses. Families were torn apart. A mother, upon seeing the telltale swelling upon her child, would know with dreadful certainty that she could not save them. Some fled their homes, abandoning loved ones in their terror. Others locked themselves indoors, only to find that death seeped through the cracks as surely as the wind. Priests walked through villages with censers of incense, chanting prayers, but even holy smoke could not banish the invisible hand that strangled the lungs and blackened the skin. The death toll defies belief. Whole towns left silent, the grass growing in the marketplace where merchants once cried their wares. In some regions, half the population was swept away. Fields lay unplowed because there were no hands left to work them. Roads were empty, for no traveler dared journey to another city, lest they bring death with them. It was as though civilization itself had cracked, leaving behind only fear and despair. And yet the Black Death was not the only enemy. Lesser plagues stalked the centuries before and after: leprosy, smallpox, measles, and fevers of all kinds. To fall ill in the Middle Ages was to walk the edge of the grave. Physicians were few, their remedies laughable to us now. They bled the patient, thinking to release the poisoned humors. They applied poultices of herbs and animal dung. They urged prayer, fasting, and the carrying of charms. Some physicians prescribed drinking potions made of crushed emeralds or powdered toads. Others recommended bathing in vinegar or pressing pigeons against the swollen buboes to draw out the sickness. These were not cures, but desperate attempts by men groping in the dark. And yet the people clung to them, for to do nothing was to surrender entirely. Superstition became a weapon more terrible than the disease itself. When the plague could not be explained, blame was cast upon the innocent. Foreigners, the poor, and above all the Jews, were accused of poisoning wells. Mobs formed, and in their madness, they dragged families from their homes, burning them in the streets in the hope that such sacrifice might appease an angry God. Thus, even as pestilence consumed them, humanity devoured itself. And what of the children, you ask? Imagine the terror in their eyes as they saw their parents collapse, their siblings carried to shallow graves, their villages silenced one house at a time. For a child in those days, the lullaby was not a mother's song, but the toll of the church bell marking yet another funeral. And for those who survived, the memories clung like shadows for life. The Middle Ages were not kind to the sick. To be ill was not only to suffer in body, but to risk being shunned, feared, or cast out. Lepers, with their wasted faces and sores, were forced to live apart, wearing bells around their necks to warn the healthy of their approach. To hear such a bell on the road was to hear the sound of despair itself. Ah, my listener, here in our century, we speak of disease with scientific certainty, but we do not feel its terror as they did. For then, it was not a question of if you would meet the plague, but when you could survive famine with luck, endure taxation with resilience, but no man could bar his door against the invisible visitor who brought coughing, fever, and death. And so, the people lived in dread. Even in years of good harvest, even in times of peace, there was no rest. Every cough in the marketplace, every rash upon the skin, every rumor of sickness in a neighboring town sent fear rushing through villages. Mothers clutched their children closer. Priests warned of God's wrath, and men wondered if they would see another summer. That, my friend, is why the Middle Ages sucked for all who lived them, because the air itself seemed cursed, and the body was but a fragile candle, ready to be snuffed out by a breath of pestilence. If famine gnawed at the belly, and pestilence rotted the flesh, then war was the iron fist that crushed whatever remained. The Middle Ages were an age of steel, but that steel was rarely lifted in noble defense. No, it was raised in greed, in ambition, in bloodlust, and the common man bore its weight most heavily. From the smallest village to the grandest city, no soul was beyond the reach of violence. To be born in medieval Europe was to be born beneath the shadow of the sword. Lords quarreled with one another, kings quarreled with kings, and when they sought to prove their might, it was not their own lives they risked, but the lives of their peasants, their vassals, and their soldiers, conscripted whether willing or not. A farmer might spend a season coaxing life from his field, only to see it trampled beneath the hooves of a passing army. A family might gather firewood for the winter, only to watch their thatched roof set ablaze by raiders. Armies did not march as neat, disciplined lines alone. They devoured everything in their path. They tore bread from tables, dragged livestock from barns, and pressed boys into service. When they left ashes, corpses, and silence. And there was no end. The 100 Years' War, which began in the 14th century, stretched across generations. Imagine being born beneath its shadow, growing to adulthood, and dying before peace was ever declared. War was not an event, it was a condition of life. But perhaps you think of the knight, clad in armor, the shining figure of romance that poets praise. But knights were not saviors of the weak. They were predators as often as protectors. A knight's duty was to his lord, not to the peasants who cowered in their villages. Many knights roamed the land as brigands in all but name, their chivalry extending only to those of equal rank. For the poor, there was no chivalry, only demands for food, taxes, and service under threat of the sword. And then there were the Crusades. How proudly the kings and popes declared them holy wars, marches to liberate distant lands. But what did they bring, in truth, to the people of Europe? They brought heavier taxes to fund expeditions, sons carried off to foreign deserts never to return, and waves of vengeance from enemies roused abroad. The banner of the cross may have been raised, but for the poor, it meant little more than hunger at home and death abroad. Villages knew the terror of raids, whether from rival lords, foreign invaders, or marauders with no allegiance at all. In the east, tales spread of Mongols sweeping across the steppe, their armies burning entire cities in a single week. In the north, Viking raiders in earlier centuries had carried terror into the hearts of coastal communities, leaving behind scars that lasted long after their sails disappeared over the horizon. And in every corner of the continent, ordinary men and women paid the price. It was not only foreign wars that plagued the land. Civil wars, peasant revolts, dynastic struggles, all spilled the blood of commoners. To be a peasant caught in such storms was to be caught between hammer and anvil. If one army came, you fed them or they killed you. If the other arrived, you did the same. Loyalty was meaningless, for survival demanded submission to whichever sword was nearest. And if you were accused of aiding the enemy, then both sides punished you with equal cruelty. The brutality of these wars was staggering. Soldiers had no mercy for the innocent. Women were not spared, children not protected. Villages were looted and burned not as accidents of war, but as strategy. Terror was a weapon, and it was wielded without restraint. Think of it: you wake in your hovel one morning, hoping only for a day's labor in the fields. By evening, your home is ashes, your family slain or scattered, and you are bound in chains, dragged away to serve as a slave. This was the reality of medieval war, repeated across centuries like a dreadful refrain. And what of justice? What of law to restrain such cruelty? The law itself was often the cruelty. Kings demanded levies, lords demanded dues, and the church demanded tithes to fund holy ventures. If you resisted, your resistance was branded treason or heresy, crimes punishable by death. To lift a hand against the nobility was not an act of defense, it was rebellion, and rebellion was crushed with fire and iron until the roads were lined with corpses as warnings. Even when battles ended, peace brought no relief. A lord who survived might build new castles, demand new taxes, and celebrate his victory with feasts bought from the sweat of his peasants. And the peasants, they returned to their fields, their backs bent once more, their eyes ever watching the horizon for the next rising smoke. In the medieval world, war was not glorious, nor was it rare. It was the rhythm of life, the drumbeat that men marched to whether they wished it or not. And for those at the bottom, it was yet another reason why existence itself felt like punishment. So, when you hear tales of gallant knights and noble crusaders, remember this: their glory was paid for in the misery of the common folk, who prayed not for banners or victories, but only for a single season of peace in which to till their soil and sleep without fear of fire in the night. If disease struck like lightning and war thundered like a storm, then serfdom was the grey sky under which all peasants lived their days. It was not sudden nor violent, but constant, steady, and suffocating. To be born a serf in the Middle Ages was to be born with invisible shackles on your wrists, shackles that no strength could break, for they were forged not of iron, but of law, tradition, and the will of lords. You see, my listener, the feudal system was a pyramid, and at its base lay the countless peasants who toiled for the survival of all above them. Kings and nobles, priests and knights, they stood tall upon the sweat of the poor. The serf, unlike the slave, was not sold in a market, but his bondage was no less severe. He was tied to the land, bound to the soil like the very crops he planted. He could not leave without permission, nor could he seek a new life elsewhere, for his master owned not only the land, but the people who worked it. And what life was this? Dawn to dusk, back bent beneath the weight of tools, hands raw from earth and frost. A man might work from the moment the cock crowed until the stars were kindled, yet the harvest was not his. A third went to the Lord, another to the church, and the remainder barely fed his family through the winter. Should the harvest fail, the Lord still took his portion, the priest still demanded his tithe, and the peasant bore the hunger. To miss a payment, to fail in duty, was to invite punishment, fines if one was lucky, lashings or imprisonment if not. And in times of rebellion, when a peasant dared to rise against the weight of his bondage, the punishment was swift and merciless. Entire villages were burned to ash, men hanged in rows along the roadside, women and children driven into the wilderness. Thus the system endured, not through loyalty, but through terror. Marriage, too, was not a free bond among serfs. A man could not wed without his lord's consent, and often a fee was required. Daughters were sometimes forced into unions that served the lord's interests rather than their own hearts. Even in matters of love, the chains of serfdom clinked and clattered. And though the church spoke of all souls being equal before God, in life it reinforced the divisions of feudal society. The priest demanded tithes, a tenth of every crop or coin, declaring it the price of salvation. To resist was to risk excommunication, which meant not only spiritual ruin, but social death. For a man cut off from the church was cut off from his community, denied burial in consecrated ground, his name a curse upon his kin. Some may argue that the Lord provided protection, that in exchange for labor, the serf received safety behind castle walls. But what protection was this, when raiders and soldiers could still trample fields and seize goods? The walls of the castle were for the lord, not the peasant. The serf was often left to the mercy of fate, a living shield to slow the enemy's approach. Consider, too, the taxes. There was a tax for grinding grain at the lord's mill, a tax for baking bread in the lord's oven, a tax for grazing animals in the lord's pasture. Even to die was costly, for the best of a serf's belongings might be seized as a death duty before his family could inherit. From cradle to grave, the Lord's hand was never absent, always reaching, always taking. And yet, the cruelty of the system lay not only in its demands, but in the hopelessness it bred, for there was no ladder to climb, no dream to pursue. A serf was born a serf, lived as a serf, and died a serf. His children inherited his toil, his grandchildren inherited theirs. The horizon never changed. The castle loomed as a symbol not of opportunity, but of permanence. The reminder that life would never be more than what it was. This hopelessness crushed the spirit more surely than hunger or disease. To labor without the hope of reward, to endure without the chance of freedom, was to live a life half-lived. And yet the peasants endured, because endurance was all they knew. To dream was dangerous, to rebel was fatal, and to despair was natural. It is little wonder, then, that the few revolts which did break out, such as the peasants' revolt in England in 1381, burned with such fury. Men who had bent their backs for lifetimes finally rose with scythes and pitchforks, storming manors and demanding justice. But the fires of rebellion were quickly stamped out by armored knights and sharpened swords. And when it was over, the chains were clasped tighter than before. So, why did it suck to live in the Middle Ages? Because freedom, the very breath of the soul, was denied to most. Because life was not lived, but endured generation after generation, beneath the weight of masters who never lifted a hand to share the burden. And because, for millions of peasants and serfs, the greatest crime was not their poverty, but the fact that their poverty was enforced as law, sanctified by both crown and church. If famine hollowed the stomach, pestilence ravaged the flesh, and war spilled the blood, then ignorance poisoned the very mind of the medieval world. For in those centuries, knowledge was a treasure locked away, guarded by priests and nobles, and the common people were left to stumble through life guided not by reason, but by fear. In the villages, where men and women bent over their fields, the world was a tapestry of omens and curses. A crow upon a rooftop was a sign of death. A cow's milk soaring meant witchcraft. A child born with a mark upon its skin was whispered to be touched by the devil. To fall sick was rarely thought the work of nature, but of sin, sorcery, or celestial wrath. Thus, every misfortune was not only a suffering, but a mystery that deepened dread. The church, it is true, was the one great light of learning in those ages, but it was also a gatekeeper. Books were written in Latin, a tongue few could understand, and guarded within monasteries, whose doors were closed to peasants. To question the teachings of priest or bishop was to invite charges of heresy, a crime more feared than theft or murder. For a thief might lose his hand, a murderer his head, but a heretic lost his soul, and often his life in fire. So, the people were taught not to question, but to submit. The earth, they believed, was the unmoving center of creation. The stars were angels' lanterns, the comets harbingers of doom. Illness was sent by God, cured only by prayer or pilgrimage. And if all prayers failed, then perhaps the sufferer was cursed, and curses could only be broken by rooting out the supposed witch who had cast them. Ah, the witch hunts! How many innocents perished in flames, accused by frightened neighbors or ambitious priests? A woman who knew the healing properties of herbs could be denounced as a servant of the devil. A widow who lived alone might be accused of riding with demons at night. Even a child could be declared possessed, and the blame laid upon some unfortunate soul who lacked the power to defend themselves. These trials were not trials as we understand them now. They were spectacles of terror. If you drowned when thrown into the river, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and burned. Thus the accused was doomed either way, and beyond witchcraft lay the endless dread of demons, spirits, and the restless dead. The medieval imagination was a haunted one. Ghosts walked in the night, fairies stole children from cradles, and the devil himself was thought to lurk in the shadows, waiting for a chance to snatch the soul of the unwary. Bells were rung in storms to drive away evil spirits. Crosses were carved into doors to ward off unseen powers. Fear was the air they breathed. But worse still was the ignorance enforced upon them. For knowledge existed. Arab scholars in the East studied the heavens and the body with precision, and even in Europe, a few brave thinkers sought truth, but such ideas were often buried beneath the weight of doctrine. A man who dared say the earth moved around the sun risked chains and fire. A physician who questioned humors risked ridicule and ruin. Progress came in whispers, and whispers were silenced by the roar of authority. Thus the common man remained in darkness. He knew little beyond his village, for travel was dangerous and learning forbidden. He lived in a small circle of fields, forests, and fears, bounded not only by poverty but by the prison of his mind. Consider this in our century. Schools spread knowledge to even the poorest, books are printed by the thousands, and ideas fly across borders with the speed of ink and steam. But in the Middle Ages, to own a single book was a privilege of the wealthy, for each was written by hand, worth more than a man's home. To read was to belong to a rare class, and to write was rarer still. The serf could labor a lifetime and never see the shape of letters upon a page. And without knowledge, superstition grew like weeds. Lightning struck, God was angry, a child wasted away, a neighbor had cursed the family, a bad harvest, the villagers had sinned. Always, the explanation was steeped in fear, never in reason, and always someone was blamed. The mind, shackled by such beliefs, was as imprisoned as the body. A serf might dream of freedom, but he could not dream of truth beyond what the church and Lord permitted. To think otherwise was to risk the flames. So why did it suck to live in the Middle Ages? Because the people were not only bound in flesh, but bound in spirit. Because fear governed every aspect of life. Fear of sin, of demons, of witches, of authority, of the unknown. And because the light of knowledge, which might have freed them, was hidden from their eyes, locked away in monasteries and guarded by the very powers that profited from their ignorance. Yes, famine starved the body, plague rotted the flesh, and war spilled blood, but superstition and ignorance consumed the soul. And of all the chains that bound the medieval man, these were the hardest to break. If war was the storm and plague the fire, then daily life in the Middle Ages was the slow drip of water on stone, unending, exhausting, and merciless in its persistence. To be born in those centuries was to inherit a life of toil, discomfort, and danger so constant that even survival felt like defeat. Begin with the body. Hygiene as we know it now scarcely existed. In villages, waste was tossed into the streets or collected in cesspits that overflowed after rain. Animals lived close to humans, their filth mingling with human refuse. The stench of dung, rot, and smoke clung to every hovel, every garment, every street. Bathing was rare, sometimes feared as unhealthy. A man might go months without washing his skin, his clothes unlaundered until lice and fleas were as much a part of his existence as the air he breathed. These vermin were not only pests but carriers of disease, creeping silently from person to person, sowing fevers and death. And food. It was not feasts of roasted meats and spiced pies as one might see in painted tapestries. For the poor, meals were monotonous and meager. Black bread, coarse and hard, brewed all that was safer than water, thin pottage of vegetables when the season was kind. Meat was a rare luxury, often stretched with bones and gristle. Malnutrition was the norm, and the body bore its mark: bowed legs, stunted growth, rotting teeth. In winters, many starved slowly, while others filled their bellies with bark, roots, or boiled leather, anything to trick the stomach into believing it had been fed. And for women, life carried its own cruelties. Childbirth was a journey through the valley of death, with no doctors trained as we know them today, and midwives armed with only tradition and luck. Many mothers did not survive the birthing bed. Infection, blood loss, and fever claimed them, leaving children to grow without mothers and husbands to remarry quickly, for survival demanded it. The children themselves were frail, half of them gone before their 5th year, carried away by fevers, hunger, or accidents that no one could prevent. Imagine the grief of a mother bearing child after child, her heart hardened not by choice but by necessity. The law, too, was no comfort. Justice in the Middle Ages was swift, brutal, and often blind. Accusations could condemn as surely as evidence. A man accused of theft might lose a hand. A woman accused of gossiping about her betters might be set in the stocks for all to mock. And in darker cases, trial by ordeal was the judge, a hand plunged into boiling water, a body cast into a river, the outcome declared to be the will of God. Such justice gave no peace to the innocent, for fate was as cruel as men. And what of shelter? The noble's castle might stand firm with stone walls and roaring fires, but the peasant's hut was a drafty shack of wattle and daub, patched with straw, its floor of dirt alive with vermin. Smoke from the hearth curled thickly within, blackening lungs and eyes. A family might huddle together with animals in winter for warmth, their breath frosting the air inside their home. Beds were sacks of straw, crawling with fleas, and blankets were coarse wool, if one was lucky enough to have them. Comfort was a dream, endurance the reality. Even leisure was scarce. Feast days, it is true, brought brief respite with games, dancing, or a fair, but these were rare jewels upon a chain of endless labor. From childhood to old age, work defined existence. Boys were sent into fields with their fathers, girls to kitchens and looms with their mothers. The elderly, if they lived long enough to be old, worked still, their bodies bent and broken, but their hands not free. For in a world where survival hung by a thread, every hand was needed until death itself finally gave release. And death, death was the most constant companion of all. It came in sickness, in hunger, in childbirth, in war, in accident. It came without warning, without mercy, and it came often. To walk through a medieval village was to walk among graves, for every churchyard swelled with the dead, their resting places marked with wooden crosses that decayed as quickly as the bodies beneath. Death was not an intruder. It was a neighbor, always present, always waiting. Even faith, which offered hope of heaven, carried its own weight of misery. The church demanded obedience, confession, tithes, and penance. A peasant might kneel in prayer not out of joy, but out of terror that his soul was damned for sins he scarcely understood. Fear of hellfire blazed hotter than the hearth in his hut. To question the priest was heresy. To skip the tithe was sin. To doubt the church was rebellion against God himself. Faith, instead of freeing, often chained minds with iron links of guilt and fear. Thus, every hour of medieval life bore its own misery. Not great disasters alone, but the small cruelties repeated daily, wore men and women down. The cold in their bones, the hunger in their bellies, the lice in their hair, the cough in their lungs, the grief in their hearts. To live was to endure. To endure was to suffer, and only the strongest, or the luckiest, survived long enough to look back with wary eyes. So, my listener, when we speak of the Middle Ages, let us not be fooled by the songs of minstrels or the paintings of nobles. Let us remember the reality, that beneath the castles and cathedrals lay a world of mud, misery, and endless struggle. A world where life itself was a burden carried on bent backs, and death, though feared, was sometimes welcomed as release. This, then, is the final answer to our tale. This is why it sucked to live in medieval times, not because of one single horror, but because of them all, pressing upon every soul every day, until the very thought of joy was as fleeting as a candle flame in the wind.